Have you ever been told you're too quiet, too distant, too different, as if silence itself was a flaw? From the first day you learned to speak, the world began measuring you not by the depth of your thoughts, but by the volume of your voice. And so, you learned to hold your words the way others hold weapons, carefully, quietly, aware of their weight. You became the listener in a room full of talkers, the observer at the edge of every crowd, the one who noticed everything but was rarely noticed in return. You learned early that silence makes people uneasy. They rush to fill it, to patch over it with noise, laughter, distraction, anything that avoids the discomfort of stillness. But for you, silence was never empty. It was a landscape vast, rich, and alive. It was where you could breathe, think, dream. While others chased attention like light through glass, you stayed in the shade, where reflection had time to grow roots. There was a time, perhaps in childhood, when this quiet felt like a crime, when teachers told you to speak up, when louder friends seemed to command the world with their noise. But what they never saw was that your silence wasn't absence, it was observation. While they performed, you perceived. While they reacted, you reflected. You weren't behind, you were beneath, watching, absorbing, understanding, more than words could ever say. Modern psychology calls it the introverted processing advantage. The brain of a quiet mind doesn't rush. It doesn't scatter energy across 1,000 directions. It dives deep and deliberate. Your neurons linger longer, turning small details into meaning, and meaning into memory. It's why you often feel exhausted after crowds, not because you lack energy, but because you give it to everything you notice. Every glance, every tone, every flicker of emotion in the air. You absorb it all. And yet, there's a quiet loneliness in this gift. Because in a world built for volume, depth can feel like isolation. You start to wonder if your silence is a defect, if you should speak louder, smile wider, become more visible to be accepted. But deep down, you know that would mean leaving yourself behind. The truth is, silence is not the opposite of power. It's the preparation for it. The strongest currents move beneath the surface. The deepest roots grow in darkness. Your quiet isn't weakness, it's wisdom, learning how to speak without words. And perhaps, one day, the world will finally learn to listen. But before that happens, you must understand where this quiet power began in the moments when the world was too loud and you chose stillness instead of surrender. Do you remember what it felt like to be small in a world that never stopped talking? The classroom was a storm of voices, laughter, chatter, footsteps pounding against the floor like rain. You sat near the window, tracing the sunlight on your desk, waiting for the noise to calm. Though it never did, every shout felt like a jolt through your skin. Every question you didn't answer became a mark against you. You weren't shy, you were surviving. For some children, the world arrives softly, but for others, it crashes in all at once, too bright, too fast, too loud. You noticed everything. The way the teacher's tone changed when she was tired, the sadness behind your mother's smile, the tension in the air before anyone even raised their voice. You didn't know it then, but your mind was built for depth, for processing, sensing, feeling. While others skipped across the surface of life, you sank into it. And in that deep place, the noise of the world felt unbearable. Neuroscientists might call it heightened sensory processing. Psychologists might call it sensitivity of the nervous system. But to you, it was simply the ache of being too aware, too tuned in to every flicker of emotion that others ignored. It wasn't that you didn't want to join the games or the laughter. It was that the world's rhythm was too quick for your heart to keep up. So you began to retreat, not out of fear, but out of self-preservation. You found safety in quiet corners, behind books, inside drawings, under blankets. Your silence wasn't emptiness, it was refuge. It was the only place you could breathe without feeling the weight of expectation pressing against your chest. But adults rarely understood this. Teachers labeled you shy. Parents told you to open up, as if your stillness was a flaw to be corrected. They mistook your reflection for resistance, your depth for detachment. And so, you learned something tragic, that to be accepted, you might have to become less of yourself. You tried to be louder, to play along, to laugh when everyone laughed. But inside, you knew the performance was thin. You could mimic the noise, but not the ease that came with it. In a loud home, silence becomes survival. In a world that rewards volume, you learned to whisper to yourself instead. That child, the one who once found safety in observation, still lives in you. Only now, it's older, better at pretending. Because somewhere along the way, you learned a painful truth. When the world refuses to understand your quiet, you start wearing a mask just to be heard. And that quiet child grows up and learns to wear a mask. You learn early that the world doesn't slow down for the quiet ones, so you adapt. You become fluent in the language of pretending, smiling when you'd rather stay still, speaking when silence would have said enough. You laugh at jokes that don't land inside you, make small talk that feels like sandpaper against your thoughts, and attend gatherings where your body stays, but your mind quietly slips away. You master the art of appearing engaged while disappearing inward. They call you reserved, mysterious, or difficult to read, but really, you're just tired of performing. Extroversion in a play you never auditioned for. You've learned that in this world, quietness must be translated to be understood. So, you put on the mask, the social disguise that lets you blend in without belonging. At work, you nod while others speak over each other, their voices competing for oxygen. You wait for your turn that rarely comes. At home, you love deeply but gently, offering warmth not in words, but in small, steady gestures. You're the partner who remembers the details. Others forget the exact way someone's face softens before they cry, the silence that follows an unspoken hurt. Yet no one sees how much it costs to be this observant. How draining it is to absorb every emotion in a room until you're carrying the weight of everyone else's noise. Psychologists call it empathic fatigue, when those with high sensitivity and deep emotional intelligence silently burn out from the very empathy that defines them. You don't explode, you quietly unravel. Alone, you take off the mask, exhaling like you've been holding your breath all day. The solitude feels like oxygen, but then the doubt creeps in. Why can't I be more like them? Why does connection feel like performance? And yet, beneath that exhaustion lies something sacred. Your silence is not absence, it's protection. You listen because you value understanding over interruption. You retreat not because you fear others, but because you crave authenticity. Your quietness filters truth, it keeps what's real and discards the noise. The world mistakes your stillness for weakness, unaware that restraint is a form of power. But masks have weight, and when worn too long, even the strongest minds start forgetting the shape of their own face. So you begin to wonder what would happen if you stopped pretending, if you stopped forcing your voice into a world that rarely listens anyway. The answer isn't rebellion, it's recognition. You were never designed to shout over chaos. Your strength was built in the spaces between sound, because beneath the mask lies a design written in the brain, not weakness, but wiring. Have you ever wondered why noise feels heavier to you than it seems to others? Why small talk drains you, but one meaningful conversation can keep you awake for hours, replaying, analyzing, feeling? It isn't weakness, it's wiring. The introverted brain doesn't simply hear, it absorbs. It doesn't just react, it reflects. You're not imagining that the world feels louder. Science confirms that, for you, it truly is. According to psychologist Hans Eysenk's arousal theory, Introverts are born with a more active cortex, the outer layer of the brain responsible for processing information. Where others seek stimulation, your mind is already lit up, processing every flicker of sound, every shift in tone, every invisible emotional current in the room. For most people, dopamine, the brain's excitement chemical, drives them toward novelty, risk, and noise. But your brain dances to a different rhythm. You respond more to acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter linked to reflection, focus, and long-term memory. You're rewarded not by what's loud, but by what's deep. That's why silence feels sacred to you, why solitude doesn't feel like absence but restoration. Your mind conserves energy, redirecting it inward toward creation, empathy, and thought. You think before you speak, not because you're unsure, but because you're building a cathedral out of meaning before letting the words step outside. It's a slower rhythm, yes, but it's precise, deliberate, alive. This is the same rhythm that guided Einstein during his long walks alone, the same quiet current that shaped Virginia Woolf's introspection and Kafka's haunting reflections. Solitude wasn't their escape, it was their method. Neuroscientists have found that introverts show stronger activation in the prefrontal cortex. The third, region linked to abstract thought, planning, and imagination. The same sensitivity that overwhelms you in crowded rooms gives you access to inner worlds most never visit. But there's a cost to such depth. Your mind's brilliance is also its burden. The same circuits that allow you to understand others so profoundly also make you feel their pain. You don't just see, you sense. You don't just listen, you receive. And sometimes, the flood of emotion and information becomes too much, forcing you to retreat into stillness just to survive your own awareness. Yet within that stillness lies something extraordinary. A consciousness designed not for volume, but for vision. A nervous system tuned not for chaos, but for clarity. Your quiet isn't the absence of reaction, it's the refinement of it. Science calls it low stimulation. Philosophy calls it depth. And what the world mistakes for withdrawal is simply your mind doing what it was built to do, to dive where others only float. There's a strange point where stillness turns on you, where the silence you once sought for peace begins to echo too loudly. You start to feel it, that subtle shift, when solitude stops being a sanctuary and starts becoming a cell. What once felt like oxygen now feels like air you have to ration. You tell yourself you prefer being alone, but somewhere beneath that calm exterior, something trembles, the quiet ache of a mind that's been alone too long. It begins slowly. You stop replying to messages, convincing yourself you'll answer later. You avoid invitations, saying you're tired, when in truth, you can't bear the thought of pretending again. The walls of your inner world, once painted in the colours of peace and introspection, begin to close in. The same thoughts that once brought clarity now loop endlessly, questions, doubts, unfinished conversations replaying like old film reels. It's not that you've stopped thinking, it's that your thoughts have stopped letting you go. Psychologists call it rumination, the brain's tendency to overprocess, to analyze emotions long after their purpose has passed. For introverts, who already dwell deeply within their minds, this becomes a quiet storm. Studies show that people who spend long periods in self-isolation experience changes in neural activity similar to those seen in physical pain. The brain doesn't distinguish much between being hurt and being unseen. And so, even when you tell yourself you're fine, your nervous system keeps whispering, something's missing. There's comfort in your isolation at first. The world feels too sharp, too demanding, and your silence feels like armor. But the more you wear it, the heavier it becomes. The walls meant for peace become padded cells of thought. You stop sharing, stop reaching, stop being known. Because every time you've tried, you were misunderstood, misread, and somewhere along the way, you decided it was safer to disappear than to risk being seen wrongly again. The paradox is cruel. You hide to protect your truth, but in doing so, you begin to lose it. Your identity blurs into the quiet. Your voice weakens, not from disuse, but from disbelief, the sense that no one would understand it anyway. The very solitude that once helped you survive begins to consume the self it was meant to save. And yet, you stay, because loneliness, when familiar, becomes easier than the unknown, because the silence, even when suffocating, is still yours. But the world doesn't discourage this, it often rewards it in strange ways. The quiet ones are praised for their composure, for being low maintenance, for asking for nothing. No one realizes that behind that calm lies a battle not against the noise of others, but against the deafening echo of your own unspoken voice. When did silence become suspicious? Somewhere between the age of broadcast and the age of the algorithm, the world decided that whoever speaks loudest must be right. You live in a culture that worships noise, a society where charisma is currency, where confidence is confused with constant display. Every space, physical or digital, hums with a single unspoken rule: be seen or disappear. And so, one by one, the quiet voices fade beneath the weight of applause, meant for the ones who never stop talking. You feel it every day in meetings, in friendships, in scrolling feeds where people shout their lives into the void. Corporate culture rewards the bold, not the thoughtful. Social media favors performance over presence. Even in classrooms, children are told to speak up instead of being taught to listen. The message repeats so often it seeps into your bones. Silence means something's wrong with you. That to belong, you must amplify yourself, not in depth, but in volume. The irony is cruel. The more the world demands you to speak, the less it wants to hear. Everything becomes an echo chamber of performance, a stage where authenticity is filtered through applause metrics. Neuroscientists studying social media behavior note how dopamine spikes not when we create meaning, but when we gain attention. The brain begins to crave validation the same way it craves sugar, fast, empty, and fleeting. Meanwhile, your kind of satisfaction, slow, deep, internal, goes unnoticed. The culture of noise isn't just external. It rewires your inner world until you, too, begin to mistake stillness for failure. And so, you start to perform. You craft versions of yourself to survive the crowd. You smile wider in photos, talk faster in groups, laugh louder than you feel. Every word becomes a costume. Every silence an apology. You start believing that your quiet must be cured, that introspection is isolation, that depth is somehow detachment. But beneath the layers of pretending, a quiet rebellion stirs. Because no matter how many masks you wear, your mind still longs for meaning, not mirrors. Philosophers once said that the soul grows in silence. But silence, today, is treated like absence, as if you're not living unless you're broadcasting proof of it. The culture of noise has made attention the new oxygen, and those who breathe slowly seem out of place. Yet what it fails to see is that there's a rhythm beneath your quiet, a language that doesn't need to shout to be heard. We mistake stillness for emptiness because we fear what doesn't perform. But silence keeps its own score, and it's emotional. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, it comes from being unseen. You know it well. It's the feeling that settles in your chest during a conversation that never quite finds depth, during a meeting where your voice stays buried beneath others, during a friendship where you give endlessly but are rarely asked how you feel. It's the weight of existing quietly in a world that only recognizes echoes. You carry storms inside, too polite to let them rain. You listen when others speak, you comfort when others break. You notice every fracture in the room, but no one notices the fractures in you. It's not their fault entirely. You've learned to hide your pain behind composure, to mask anxiety with gentleness, to turn every emotional earthquake into still water. The world calls it calm, but you know it's exhaustion disguised as grace. Psychologists describe this as internalized inhibition, when emotional restraint becomes habit. Over time, it rewires your nervous system. You grow so attuned to other people's moods that your own start to blur. You sense tension before anyone speaks it. You absorb anger that isn't yours. And somewhere between empathy and over-awareness, you begin to forget where you end and others begin. That's why even joy feels complicated. When something good happens, a small voice whispers that it's temporary, that the silence will return, heavier than before. In relationships, you love with a kind of quiet loyalty that goes unnoticed until it's gone. You're the one who remembers the details no one told you twice, who forgives before the apology comes, who keeps the peace even when it costs your own. But beneath that tenderness lies an ache, the longing to be understood without having to perform it. Because even the most peaceful hearts grow weary of always being the calm in everyone else's storm. Over years, this hidden labor turns into burnout, not from activity, but from restraint. The constant filtering of your emotions, the endless overthinking of what you said, how you were perceived, whether you mattered at all, it drains your spirit quietly, like sand leaking from an unseen crack. Neuroscience calls it cognitive fatigue. Philosophy calls it the tragedy of consciousness to feel deeply in a world that only skims the surface. And yet, you endure because somewhere within that fatigue lives the same strength that's kept you gentle in a crowded, harsh world. The same awareness that makes you ache also makes you wise. You may feel the weight of your quiet heart, but beneath it lies a design that has always held meaning, even when it hurt. Yet what if the very traits that cause this pain are the ones that hold their salvation? There comes a moment when you stop running from your own quiet, when the silence that once felt like isolation begins to sound like truth. You start to see that you were never weak for needing space. You were starving for oxygen in a world addicted to noise. The transformation doesn't happen all at once. It's slow, like dawn breaking behind heavy clouds. But one day, you realize that solitude is not your prison, it's your power. The shift begins when you stop apologizing for your depth. When you stop trying to explain why you leave early, why you prefer small circles, why your best ideas arrive when you're alone. You realize that solitude isn't withdrawal, it's maintenance. It's how your nervous system recalibrates, how your mind refuels, how your soul returns to equilibrium. Neuroscientists have found that solitude activates the brain's default mode network, the system responsible for reflection, creativity, and self-understanding. While others seek stimulation, you're building structure. You're not avoiding life, you're metabolizing it. But power doesn't come from vanishing into silence, it comes from carrying that silence back into the world. Carl Jung called it individuation, the process of uniting the inner and outer self. It's when the quiet observer steps forward, not to dominate, but to define. You begin to set boundaries, not from fear, but from clarity. You no longer say yes to things that drain you, nor chase validation that demands your self-betrayal. The more you protect your energy, the more it multiplies. There's a kind of confidence that doesn't need an audience, the kind that hums instead of shouts. You start to see your stillness not as a flaw, but as a form of mastery. Observation becomes your strength. Patience becomes your strategy. In a world obsessed with reaction, you become the one who responds measured, aware, composed. You no longer mistake gentleness for weakness, nor silence for submission. Because the more you embrace your quiet nature, the more you begin to hear things others miss, the tremors. Beneath conversation, the patterns within chaos, the truths hidden between words. And as you turn inward, without disappearing, something miraculous happens. The line between inner peace and outer strength begins to blur. You stop fighting your nature and start shaping it into art, empathy, wisdom, and presence. You no longer seek to be louder, only to be clear. The goal isn't to outshine anyone, it's to illuminate what others overlook. because, in the end, the quiet ones don't conquer the world by volume but by vision, and in that clarity lies something far older than personality, a philosophy. In a world drunk on noise, silence has become the last act of rebellion. Every moment hums with urgency messages flashing, voices competing, opinions colliding. It's as if the world believes that to exist, you must be seen, and to be seen, you must speak. But you've begun to understand something quieter, something ancient, that the truest presence is not in what is said, but in what is felt between the words. You see it in the way the morning light enters a room before anyone wakes, in the way breath slows when you stop needing to prove anything. The silence that once frightened you now feels like a friend, the kind who doesn't demand, doesn't perform, doesn't rush. It doesn't fill space, it honors it. And in that stillness, you start to hear what the world has forgotten: the rhythm of your own thoughts, the sound of your own becoming. Philosophers and mystics knew this long before science ever caught up. The Stoics practiced it in restraint, knowing that control of one's voice began with control of one's mind. The Taoists called it Wu Wei, effortless action, the art of letting truth move through you instead of forcing it. And the Zen masters sat for hours in meditation, not to escape the world, but to hear it properly. Each of them pointed toward the same quiet truth, that silence is not emptiness, it's awareness condensed. It is the space in which everything real takes shape. Modern psychology now echoes this wisdom. Studies show that silence lowers cortisol, restores neural balance, and strengthens the part of the brain tied to empathy. When you withdraw from noise, you're not disconnecting, you're resetting your internal compass. You're giving your nervous system permission to return home. The same solitude that once felt like exile now reveals itself as sanctuary. You begin to see that listening is not passive, it's one of the most active forms of intelligence. To listen deeply is not one of the mesa, to live deeply. Because listening demands humility, the courage to admit you don't have to fill every void, solve every moment, or define every feeling. It's in that humility that wisdom takes root. The more you listen, the more you see how everything, people, nature, even silence itself, speaks a language older than words. So you sit in the quiet, not to escape the world, but to hear it as it really is. You start to sense that change, real, lasting change, doesn't come from shouting your truth into the void, but from living it so completely that the silence itself begins to speak. The world was never changed by those who shouted the loudest, but by those who first listened.